Having discussed history in the introductory lecture, in this lecture I want to discuss our starting point. You'll notice that the course is entitled World History Since 1500, but we're actually beginning somewhat earlier, and I wanted to explain why. It's related to understanding what we think of when we think of world history. Should history of the world be a history of each distinct region and civilization? In that case, how could we ever cover anything adequately? The 70,000-foot view of world history would be so generalized that it would be very difficult to say anything serious about any particular world civilization. So the question might be raised about what would truly be world about such an approach to history. In this course, I'm going to focus on world history, looking more at interconnections, at the human contacts, exchanges, and interactions taking place between these different world civilizations. So in a sense, no world civilization will get fair treatment, but we'll focus instead on how they connected and contacted and exchanged among themselves with other world civilizations. In short, we'll be thinking of world history as a history of what today we would call globalization. Now, this isn't to say that earlier civilizations were completely isolated. Of course, some were, but as world civilizations developed, there were various contacts between them. Trading connections developed over vast distances. The Amber Road, the Salt Road, united societies across Europe. The Silk Roads were trading connections between Asia and other parts of the world. There were various attempts at political expansion. The Persian Empire tried to expand. Alexander the Great brought much of the western end of Eurasia under his control. And yet, sustained interconnections over long distances that continue without being interrupted by periods of renewed isolation really only take off with the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. So our starting point will really be with the story of the Mongols. When you think about the Mongol empires and the way they knitted the Asian and European continents together across Eurasia, the question might arise, why in this particular region of the globe did this kind of empire building take place? North and South America have grasslands also, the prairies of Northern America, the pampas of South America. Why did steppelander societies in these regions not develop major empires? North and South America's grasslands cover a north-south axis, crossing climate zones, rather than being located at the same latitude. Other factors also hampered communications. Besides this geographical fact, for instance, in North America and South America, the horse had died out around 10,000 years ago, and so there was no method of transportation that played the role that the horse played in the Mongol empires. Africa's Sahel has horses and horse-born steppelander peoples, but it also failed to establish a major empire uniting geographic regions. In the Sahel, desert peoples attacked any incipient empire as it began to rise. And ironically enough, the Sahel is rich enough in certain regions to create stable agrarian states, states that blocked the connection by Sahel empires to regions east of Lake Chad in Africa. On the other hand, Eurasia was characterized by extensive grasslands that ran along a lengthy east-west axis without huge, insurmountable geographic barriers. Running along similar latitudes meant that plants and animals easily adapted to movement from the western or eastern end to the other side. Climatic conditions were similar, favoring the survival of transplants, whether those were insects, plants and animals, or human beings. And finally, for sustained communication, highways need to have people at each end that want to be in connection. Each end of Eurasia had relatively populous and productive societies at it. Mutual trade benefited both Asia, which wanted to gain the silver and gold that Europe and southwestern Asia and northeastern Africa were willing to trade for the products that Asia created, and the western end of the Eurasian dumbbell also really desperately wanted the luxury products of Asia, so it benefited both sides. In the 13th century, the Mongols burst on the settled societies in their neighborhood like some kind of force of nature or judgment from the gods. But they hadn't come from nowhere. The Eurasian steppe had been the home of nomadic peoples for centuries, and in fact Chinese records mention Mongol-speaking nomads along about the year 700 of the Common Era. Like other nomadic societies on the steppes, the Mongols practiced pastoralism as well as trade and raiding of the sedentary societies around them. Essentially self-sufficient, this was made possible largely by the fact that they pastured herds of different kinds of animals, each of them with a different life cycle, gestation cycle, lactation cycle, and so on, so that food was always available throughout the course of the year, no matter what particular animal was at that moment lactating or suitable for slaughter and eating. Like the plurality of their herds, the Mongols practiced a plurality of religious practice. Traditional Mongol society gave a very strong position in society to the shamans, the holy men who could speak to the spirits of ancestors, which were kept in felt bags at the entryway to the Mongols' felt tents or yurts. But over the course of time, they became exposed to Buddhism, to the great eastern branch of Christianity, the Nestorian Christian religion, and to the Muslims after the emergence of Islam. Overlying Mongol society across the steppe was the dream that there might someday emerge one ruler to unite all the Mongol peoples as the Great Khan. Over time, Mongol society began to experience change as well on the steppeland as major chieftains emerged and gathered power. In their conflict with their sedentary neighbors, Mongol chiefs had a chance to gain wealth and also military power, and they called this practice catching cranes, trapping birds who could be very valuable and useful to them later on. By building up wealth and gaining personal followers, they were able to create a base of power that did not rely upon the traditional clan relationships and power of the shamans in Mongol society. The man who created the great Mongol Empire was the son of one such rising chieftain. Born perhaps around the year 1160 of the Common Era and given the name Temujin, this man carried the process of developing personal power through crane catching even further. Beginning as an ally with one of the Mongol clans to which his father was related, he soon moved to a position of leadership, practicing the absorbing of his defeated foes into his own groups, breaking down traditional clan barriers and hostilities, building up a formidable confederation which in the end united more than Mongols and including many peoples who spoke Turkic languages. By the year 1206 of the Common Era, Temujin had actually united the entire steppe, and he was invested as the Great Khan, taking the title Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan as it's spelled in Western languages, a title which has a very obscure meaning. Most scholars consider that Genghis may refer to the ocean, and the title implies, therefore, the man destined to rule the entire world between the oceans. Having united the steppe, Genghis Khan undertook a process of expansion and conquest unlike any that had ever before been seen. He tackled the settled societies of the three parts that China had been broken into. He extended his rule across the steppes into Persia. In the end, he also entered Europe. And so by the time of his death and that of his immediate followers, Mongol rule extended from Korea in the east to Hungary in the west, from Moscow to Baghdad. And this tremendous advance was made possible by Mongol skill in warfare. They were able to adapt new technologies, adding to their traditional steppelander prowess on horseback and with the bow. By the time they were subduing Song China in the south, they were using siege engines developed for them by Persian engineers who had joined their service after they had conquered Persia. So they were willing to adapt to hire land armies, foot soldiers, and above all else, they made a very effective use of terror. Mongol conquests often ended with massacres of populations. When a city resisted a Mongol siege, its survivors often were slaughtered after the city surrendered. This use of terror also made easier future Mongol conquests, as the dread of Mongol practices spread in advance of their arrival. After Genghis Khan's death, his inheritance was divided up among the members of his immediate family. His sons and his grandsons emerged as rulers of khanates in their own right, but the tradition continued that one of their member would be the Great Khan and have titular overlordship over all the other groups. As they conquered settled societies, the Mongols adapted, They also made use of the available expertise of local elites. They relied on local traditions. They practiced tax farming as one way of raising revenue, using local people to gather the taxes, which let the Mongol rulers themselves focus on feasting, on hunting, on internal disputes with their relatives, and on other traditional Mongol pastimes, rather than the day-to-day governing of their vast realm. But all across that realm, for the space of about 150 years, there existed a unique period of connectivity, of stability, of political control that is referred to as the Mongol Peace. Control of the steppes by one society, which was able to police it and to enforce conditions along it, created stable conditions along the Silk Roads, which ran to the south of the steppes. Along the north of the steppes, horseback was the best way of travel, and large merchant caravans were not so suitable for that region. But one papal envoy made the journey of 3,000 miles from Europe to the Mongol court at Karakorum in only 106 days, which at that time was an amazing speed. The Mongols secured the traditional Silk Road trade route south of the mountains as well, enabling more exchanges along those routes than had previously been possible. They also welcomed talented and experienced administrators of whatever creed or ethnicity they came, and in that way helped knit together the different societies along the territory that they had conquered, bringing groups into contact with each other in ways that had not been possible previously. During the era of the Mongol peace, the Mongols ruled the steppe land in traditional ways, and yet also their empire extended beyond the steppe. Overall, the Mongol domains were run in a relatively decentralized way, with the Great Khan holding titular authority over other regions. But after Genghis Khan's death, 3 major world regions were added to the Mongol Empire, and each of them was treated in a slightly different way. China, with the defeat of the southern Song dynasty and the creation of the Yuan or Mongol dynasty, became part of the Mongol Empire. In Persia, the Mongol attacks ended the caliphate and led to the creation of what is known as the Ilkhan state, Ilkhan meaning subordinate Khan. And in Russia, the destruction of Kievan Rus by the Golden Horde brought large parts of the easternmost part of the European continent under direct Mongol control. We'll begin with China under the Mongols. There, Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, immortalized in the famous poem In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, ruled from 1265 to 1294, establishing a new capital at Beijing, the northern capital. He began to style himself as a Chinese emperor, even though he remained a Mongol ruler. He combined aspects of both practices. Like the Mongols, he was quite happy to use talent wherever it came from, so he introduced Mongols and Muslims into Chinese government, which had not been heard of in previous dynasties. Mongol domination caused various effects in East Asia. Inside China, it led to a re-centralization, as the 3 parts that China had fallen into were reunited under Mongol rule. Trade picked up because the Mongols respected trade and did not consider being a merchant a degrading profession. And government extended over the entire territory again. Generally speaking, prosperity was limited to the cities, however, because Mongol extraction of the production of the peasantry in the form of taxes and of levies meant that the countryside was quite impoverished. Wealth was extracted for the benefit of the Mongol Khans. In addition, twice the Mongols attempted to conquer Japan, but as we shall see in a moment, both times they failed. In Persia, where the Ilkhan state grew up, Mongol armies led to the defeat of the Abbasid Caliphate, and in 1260 the last caliph was executed. Conflicts within the Mongol Empire increased the autonomy of the Ilkhan state, and the West became interested in the existence of this non-Muslim state, yet at this point the Ilkhans had not adopted Islam, and attempted to gain allies there to attack the Muslim Mamluks who were ruling Egypt at the time. However, in 1295, the Ilkhan ruler decided definitively to choose Islam as his religion, and this meant that the traditional Mongol toleration of other religions was severely circumscribed, and Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, and other religious believers found their privileges removed and eventually found themselves under great pressure either to emigrate or to accept Islam. Nevertheless, the Ilkhans did remain quite eclectic. Their art, for instance, includes the representation of human and animal figures in ways that are not permitted in typical Sunni Muslim art. And indeed, one of the later Ilkhans for some time accepted the Shia version of Islam, with the result that in Persia, a large Shia community remained, even though later Ilkhan rulers went back to becoming Sunni Muslims. Persia was linked to the broader Mongol world by its connection to Genghis Khan's descendants, and that meant that the Chinese and Persian culture mutually interpenetrated and influenced each other, with impact on Persian design and textiles, as well as Persian contributions to Chinese science and astronomy. In the case of Kievan Rus, the Mongol invasion led by Khan Batu and the group of Mongols known as the Golden Horde was tremendously destructive of the early East Slavic societies that had grown up around Kiev as the major city. Kiev was sacked in 1240 so devastatingly that perhaps out of the entire city only 200 houses were left standing, and even a generation later, travelers passing by the region talked about walking over decaying human bodies. The Golden Horde set up a permanent capital at Sarai on the lower Volga River. But throughout Russia they ruled largely indirectly, which was not a new Mongol practice, but was very effective in Russia. They appointed Russian princes as their representatives, but these Russian princes had to come to the Khan at Sarai and to make a humiliating obeisance in a ritual there. Russians basically, although they revolted numerous times and resented it, Russians basically submitted to Mongol rule for several reasons. One, of course, was terror. The sack of Kiev was an object lesson in Mongol capability of cruelty. Secondly, the Mongols came not to destroy, but actually to exploit. If taxes were collected and paid to the Mongols, the Russians were allowed to continue to practice their Orthodox religion, and therefore the Russian Orthodox Church became a very strong part of Russian culture and Russian politics, and they were allowed to govern their own affairs more or less without direct Mongol interference. In fact, some Russian princes were later able to parlay Mongol confirmation into authority within Russia. And finally, also, there was a great threat at the time from the West, as the Baltic kingdoms, the Swedes, and the Poles and the Lithuanians on the southern coast of the Baltic organized states that began to threaten the East Slavs that had formerly been grouped around Kiev. After the collapse of Kiev, the two most important sites of East Slavic settlement were Novgorod in the northwest, a trading city with self-governing institutions, and Muscovy, a town that was far enough away from the direct path of Mongol invasions of the rest of Europe to be spared repeated destruction, and which later became an important center for the re-emergence of a Russian state. The limits of Mongol conquest were reached eventually, and one of those limits was Japan. Twice, in 1274 and 1281, Kublai Khan attempted to invade Japan, but his attempts were repulsed by Japanese resistance and by the arrival of a major typhoon which blew his invasion fleet away and out to sea, where much of it perished. The Japanese referred to this as the divine wind, or kamikaze, a term, of course, that's familiar in the history of the Second World War as well. Mongol expansion was halted in Egypt as well, where the Mamluks had revolted against the heirs of Saladin and established a Sunni Muslim dynasty of their own. In conflict with the Ilkhan rulers, the Mamluks were able to defeat the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1258, which checked Mongol expansion into the Mediterranean East and the traditional heartland of Islam, leaving that, for the time being at least, under the control of Sunni Muslims who were not Mongols. And in South Asia also, the conflicts with the Mamluks led to the emergence of local Muslim Turkic-speaking raider groups that preyed on Hindu populations further to the south. One of these raiders eventually seized control of the easternmost fort of these groups at Delhi, from which he extended raids and exploitation into the Hindu south, establishing a Muslim but not Mongol sultanate in Delhi, from which Muslim rulers exploited, expanded, and traded with and fought with Hindu rulers further to the south. So the Mongol world consisted of the Central Eurasian heartland with the three Mongol-ruled appendages of Russia, the Ilkhan state in Persia, and China, and then beyond the Mongol fringes, connections and contacts into South Asia, the Middle East and Africa, and Europe. The initial Mongol conquests might have suggested that the Christian world was contracting. Certainly the Christian kingdoms of Eastern Europe were ravaged and nearly destroyed by the Mongol invasions of the 1240s. Attempts to revive the Crusades by such monarchs as Louis IX of France generally failed, and eventually the crusading states in the Middle East were completely wiped out. Yet on the peripheries, in Spain and in the Baltic, the Christian world was still expanding. In Spain against the Muslim rulers of southern and southwestern Spain and the Balearic Islands. In the Baltic against the still pagan peoples of the Baltic coastlines, the Prussians, the Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians. Internally, in the world of the mind, Europe in the 13th and 14th century was marked by a growing empiricism, an interest in the natural world, in observation, and in experimentation. This is related to the rise in the Church of St. Francis and the Franciscan order that he founded. Francis personified the world, admired it, saw it as God's creation and worthy of study in its own right, and this attitude to the natural world around them shaped the Franciscans' approach to understanding things like medicine, science, perhaps even theology. It's no accident that Umberto Eco made the main detective figure in The Name of the Rose a Franciscan friar, because that kind of observation and deduction was very typical of the Franciscans' approach to the world. So during the era of the Mongol peace, Europe benefited. It benefited from a more secure and easily traversed Silk Road. Not to say that the journey was simple. It was still very strenuous and very difficult, but Mongol patrols made it safer. Mongol passports ensured the safe passage of goods and of people there and back again. Among the travelers who made that journey, perhaps the most famous is the Italian Marco Polo, who traveled to the east and back from 1271 to 1295, spending several years at the court of Kublai Khan, the supreme Khan in China. The tale of Marco Polo's travels became a European bestseller even before movable type made the printing of books easy, and it influenced European attitudes towards the East significantly. Another important Mongol observer from the West was William of Rybrook, a cleric who was sent by the King of France to the Mongol court of Mungke Khan, hoping to find in the Mongols allies against the Mamluks and other rulers in the Muslim world that would join in Louis's dream of a new crusade. That dream never came to fruition, but William of Rybrook was able to provide a thorough and very enlightening discussion of Mongol society and the Mongol court as a dispassionate observer. New ideas also traveled along the trade routes that the Mongols held secure. Paper and paper money, common in the Arab world and China, became known in Western Europe, and although paper money took a long time to catch on, the printing of paper, the production and use of paper, I should say, became much more commonplace. From China came gunpowder, coal, movable type. The Mongol passports established the idea of passports. From Persia and from China came higher mathematics, and many other examples could be adduced. The impact of all of this exchange on European science and technology was quite significant. Here, new ideas enriched European attitudes and knowledge, which essentially found the new products and ideas from the East to be superior, except in two major areas. In one area, in the making of glass, Europe already had a high level of technological skill. This had been stimulated by the change from Romanesque to Gothic in architecture and the fashion for decorating the new large Gothic windows with colored glass. Stained glass technology stimulated the development of glass-making skills and technology, and from church needs to noble luxury products such as glass for windows, mirrors, optical lenses, and other products. And this expertise in glassmaking, when it was later united to expertise in mechanical clockworking, helped give Western astronomy and Western science a leg up. Clockworking was the other area where Western science was better than the models in the East. And again, the stimulus came from interesting sources. The life of the Western Christian monastery was ruled by hours. There are certain services that have to take place at fixed hours of the day. And depending on the climate, the sun may rise at a different time or set at a different time or reach its zenith at a different time. And so monastic life ruled by hours benefited from the development of mechanical ways of measuring time. As the towns of European society began to grow and develop in the 12th and 13th century, the measurement of time by mechanical means became important there too, especially those towns that lived by commerce. Time is money, as the saying goes. And in the 13th and 14th century, towns all across Europe became dominated by town hall towers with a large clock in them, measuring time. Western skills in time measurement mattered in the long run for the prestige of Western science as compared to its Chinese and Muslim counterparts, a process that really didn't reach its culmination until the 17th or even the 18th century, but which was to matter centuries later, and whose origins can be seen even in these early centuries. So if we were to try to arrive at an overall balance sheet for the impact of the Mongols on the world that they transformed, we would have to focus on the movement of peoples, the trade, and the movement of ideas across Eurasia. New innovations and ideas reached Europe, and in turn, the experience of travelers such as Marco Polo or William of Rubruck increased interest and knowledge in Europe about the East. Communication made possible by the Mongol conquests brought people into contact with each other. The destruction of previous societies led to the rise of new peoples to power. In the Muslim world, Turkic dominance, the Ottoman Empire, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mamluks in Egypt replaced Arab dominance. New elites arose in the Russian world. The Mongols contributed to the ending of political rule by Arabs, and their expansion into the Slavic East checked the continuing pressure of German peoples from Central Europe into the Eastern Slavic lands. Finally, in China, the Mongols provided, for the first and for a long time the only time, a foreign dynasty to rule in China. But they reunited China and brought it under a single government. So the Mongol creation of a single united Eurasian steppe brought into contact societies that had long been separate from each other, even if they might have known about their existence or traded goods through many different way stations over a difficult journey. They allowed for the freer movement of peoples, the freer movement of goods and ideas, but also the freer movement of germs and diseases.